May 15, 1940. France is falling. The German Wehrmacht, Hitler's unstoppable war machine, tears through Europe like a knife through paper. But at a small village called Arranes, 1,000 Nazi soldiers surround just 40 men. Black men. Senegal's soldiers, the world said, weren't human enough to fight. For 3 days they held the line. And what Hitler did next would expose his greatest fear. Most people learn about World War II as if it were a story written exclusively by and about white men. The brave Allied soldiers storming beaches, the heroic resistance fighters, the noble generals. But there's a chapter that's been deliberately torn out of that story. A chapter written in blood by men whose skin color made them invisible to history even as they saved the very nations that enslaved them. The Tigre Senegal. The name itself is a lie of sorts because while it translates to Senegal's riflemen, these soldiers came from across French West Africa. Senegal, yes, but also Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Ivory Coast, and beyond. France's colonial empire was vast, and it fed that empire's wars with the bodies of colonized men. Hundreds of thousands of them served in both world wars, fighting on frozen European battlefields thousands of miles from home, defending a nation that refused to see them as fully human. The recruitment process was brutal in its own right. French colonial administrators would descend on villages with quotas to fill. Sometimes men volunteered, seduced by promises of French citizenship, adventure, or simply a way to escape crushing poverty. But often they were forced. Village chiefs under pressure from colonial authorities would hand over young men. Families would hide their sons. The French called it recruitment. It was conscription at gunpoint. And what did France offer these men in return for their service? Less pay than white soldiers, inferior equipment, the most dangerous positions on the front lines. They were shock troops, human shields, expendable assets in a war that wasn't theirs. European propaganda painted them as savages barely controlled by their civilized French officers. German newspapers ran cartoons depicting them as subhuman monsters. Even Allied propaganda struggled with the cognitive dissonance of asking black soldiers to fight for freedom while denying them basic dignity. By May 1940, that dignity was about to be tested in the most horrific way imaginable. Hitler's blitzkrieg had accomplished in 6 weeks what Germany couldn't do in 4 years during World War I. Poland had fallen in 35 days. Denmark surrendered in 6 hours. Norway, despite British help, collapsed in 2 months. Now France, the great military power that had dominated European warfare for centuries, was being systematically destroyed. Entire French divisions were surrendering without firing a shot. The roads were clogged with millions of refugees fleeing south. The government was preparing to abandon Paris. It was chaos. It was defeat. It was the end. And in that chaos, the Tigre Senegal found themselves abandoned. White French officers deserted their posts, leaving African soldiers without leadership, without orders, without hope. Supply lines collapsed. Reinforcements never came. These men were scattered across northern France, often surrounded, always outnumbered, facing an enemy that had proven unstoppable. At a small village called Iran in the Somme region, a group of Senegal soldiers prepared to make their stand. They were led by Captain Charles N'Chouri, a remarkable man who embodied everything the racist ideologies of the era said was impossible. Born in Gabon to a local chief's family, Nuier had risen through the French colonial system through sheer brilliance and determination. He was educated, cultured, fluent in French, and a decorated veteran of France's colonial wars. He commanded respect from his men, not through fear, but through competence and courage. He was exactly the kind of black leader that white supremacy insisted could not exist. His orders were simple and suicidal. Hold the bridge at Arras to buy time for French civilians and soldiers to evacuate south. It was a delaying action, a sacrifice play. Everyone understood what it meant. They were being asked to die so that others might escape. The German forces approaching Arras expected an easy victory. They had tanks, artillery, air support, and overwhelming numerical superiority. Intelligence reports suggested light resistance from a demoralized, abandoned unit of colonial troops. They anticipated a quick battle, maybe a surrender, then a continuation of their lightning advance toward Paris. On May 15th, they demanded that surrender. Captain Inurier's response was a single rifle shot. What followed was 3 days that would haunt German military commanders and reveal a truth that Nazi ideology could not accommodate. 40 Senegalese soldiers outnumbered more than 20-1, transformed farmhouses into fortresses. They used every scrap of terrain, every stone wall, every ditch to their advantage. They fired with discipline and precision, making every bullet count. When ammunition ran low, they fought with bayonets and whatever weapons they could scavenge from the dead. German after-action reports described the battle with a mixture of frustration and unwilling admiration. They wrote of fanatical resistance and impossible defensive capabilities. Wehrmacht officers trained in the doctrine of Aryan superiority found themselves unable to explain how black soldiers equipped with inferior weapons and no support were decimating German infantry companies with humiliating efficiency. But the Senegalese weren't fighting for France. Not really. They were fighting for something deeper. They were fighting against every racist who had ever told them they were inferior. Against every colonial administrator who had treated them as subhuman. Against every piece of propaganda that said black men couldn't be disciplined soldiers, couldn't be brave, couldn't be warriors. Every German they stopped, every hour they held that bridge was a declaration. We are men. We are soldiers and we will not be erased. For 3 days they held. 3 impossible bloody days. The Germans threw everything at them. Infantry assaults, tank attacks, artillery barrages. The farmhouses were reduced to rubble. The fields were cratered. The bridge itself was damaged but not destroyed. And still the Senegalese fought on. By the morning of May 18th it was over. Not because they surrendered, but because they'd run out of ammunition, out of food, out of options. The Germans overran the position in a final assault. Some of the Senegalese died fighting. Others were captured, wounded, exhausted, but unbowed. What happened next revealed the darkest truth of all. The captured Senegalese soldiers were not treated as prisoners of war. They were executed systematically, deliberately. Kaptener, wounded but alive, was brought before a German officer. The details of what happened come from a handful of survivors who escaped and from German military documents that wouldn't surface until decades later. The German officer looked at this educated French-speaking black man who had commanded white soldiers and humiliated the Wehrmacht for 3 days. According to the testimony, he said something to the effect of, "A Negro like you has no right to command white men, has no right to wear a French officer's uniform." Captain Encher stood as straight as his wounds would allow. He looked his executioner in the eye and said he was French, that he had fought for France, that he had earned his rank through service and sacrifice. The German officer shot him in the head. What followed was a massacre that the world would ignore for 70 years. German forces executed between 40 and 90 captured Senegalese soldiers at Era and the surrounding villages. They weren't killed in combat. They weren't casualties of war. They were murdered because of the color of their skin. Hitler had issued a secret directive that black French prisoners were not to be treated as legitimate prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. They were to be eliminated. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1940 campaign, as France fell, German forces systematically massacred Senegalese soldiers who had surrendered or been captured. Conservative estimates put the number at 3,000 men. They were shot in fields, in barns, in ditches. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Their families back in Africa were never told what happened. They simply vanished from history. France said nothing. The Allies said nothing. After all, acknowledging the massacre would mean acknowledging that black soldiers had fought with extraordinary courage, and that opened uncomfortable questions about colonialism, about racism, about the very foundations of European supremacy. So these men died twice, once on the battlefield, and once in the historical record. But the betrayal didn't end with their deaths. After the war, when victory had been secured in part through the blood of African soldiers, France made a calculated decision. The pensions and benefits promised to colonial veterans were either denied outright or frozen at humiliatingly low rates. A black veteran from Senegal who'd fought in the same battles as a white French soldier received a fraction of the pension. The men who'd saved France were told essentially that their service wasn't worth the same as a white man's. In December 1944, Senegal's veterans gathered at a military camp in Thiroye near Dakar to demand the back pay they were owed. They'd fought for 4 years. They'd been promised compensation. They wanted what they'd earned. The French response was to open fire on them. At least 35 veterans were killed, though some historians believe the death toll was over 300. The men who'd held the line at Arras, who defended France when France wouldn't defend itself, were massacred by the nation they'd served. For 70 years, France maintained that the 1940 massacres were isolated incidents, tragic casualties of a chaotic retreat. Nothing systematic, nothing racial. Until 2009, when a historian named Raphael Schicks uncovered German military archives that proved beyond doubt what had happened. These weren't combat deaths. They were war crimes. They were genocide. And France had covered it up for 7 decades. In 2020, 80 years after arranges, France finally acknowledged the massacre. Captain Noir was posthumously honored. Memorials were proposed. Apologies were issued. But the vast majority of people still don't know this story. Still don't know that 200,000 African soldiers served France in World War II. Still don't know that 30,000 of them died. Still don't know that 3,000 were murdered for being black. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to decide what's remembered. And for 80 years, the world decided that the Tigray Senegal weren't worth remembering. Their courage was too inconvenient. Their sacrifice too challenging to racist narratives. Their deaths too damning to colonial powers that wanted to maintain the fiction of their own benevolence. But the truth has a way of surfacing. Captain Encher and his men proved something that white supremacy desperately needed to suppress. That courage has no color. That heroism isn't bound by race. That the men they called savages could outfight, outthink, and outlast armies built on hate. They held the line when others fled. They fought with honor when their allies abandoned them. They died as warriors when the world insisted they were less than human. And they were erased because their very existence shattered the mythology that justified colonialism, slavery, and genocide. We remember them now not just to honor their sacrifice, but to understand that every history book, every memorial, every story we tell about the past is a choice. Someone decided which heroes to celebrate and which to bury. Someone decided which massacres to investigate and which to cover up. Someone decided that these black soldiers weren't worth a chapter in the story of World War II. But legends don't die when they're buried. They wait in archives and testimonies, in unmarked graves and forgotten villages, in the memories of families who were told their fathers and brothers simply disappeared. They wait until someone finally decides to dig them up and let the world see what was hidden. The Tigray Senegal were legends, and now finally their story is being